Before we begin, if you find yourself enjoying these peculiar tales of history's oddest corners, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more stories that wander the fine line between fascinating and soporific. Tonight, we delve into the first chapter of our series, Labyrinthine, Origins of Castle Design, where we explore how medieval architects prioritized defense over convenience, leading to intentionally confusing layout. Imagine, if you will, a world where the greatest threat to your nightly peace wasn't insomnia or a snoring spouse, but the very walls around you. In the dim candlelight of a medieval castle, even the most confident lord could find himself pacing the same corridor for the third time, muttering curses under his breath. This was no accident. The architects of these stone behemoths were not inept draftsmen who forgot to include sensible floor plans. No, they were cunning strategists who understood that the best way to repel an enemy was to make sure they couldn't find the dining hall, let alone the lord's chambers. The medieval castle was not a home. It was a fortress, a chessboard of cold stone where every hallway, staircase, and alcove was a calculated move in a game of survival. The concept of user-friendly design would have been met with laughter, followed by a swift suggestion to try living in a thatched hut if one preferred simplicity. Convenience was sacrificed at the altar of defense, and the result was a maze so baffling that even the rats had to leave breadcrumbs. Consider the humble spiral staircase. To the untrained eye, it is a simple means of ascending or descending. But in a castle, it was a psychological weapon. Most spiral staircases were built to ascend clockwise, forcing right-handed attackers, the majority, to fight with their sword arms cramped against the central pillar, while defenders could swing freely downward. The steps themselves were often uneven, some tall, some short, so that an invading force, charging upward in the dark, would inevitably trip, stumble, and pile into a groaning heap of armored confusion. And if by some miracle they reached the top, they'd likely find themselves in a dead-end garderobe, because the architect had taken particular joy in placing the real door 3 steps back and hidden behind a tapestry of a particularly unflattering ancestor. Then there were the corridors. Long, narrow, and punctuated by sudden turns, they were designed to bottleneck attackers into vulnerable single-file lines. But they also had a delightful habit of leading nowhere. A servant sent to fetch wine might round a corner and find himself face to face with a blank wall, or worse, a door that opened onto a 30-foot drop into the moat. Historians debate whether these were genuine architectural oversights or dark jokes played by masons who'd grown tired of noblemen micromanaging their work. Either way, they ensured that even the castle's residents were never entirely sure where they were going. The pinnacle of this defensive absurdity was the keep within a keep. Some castles featured an inner stronghold so isolated by layers of walls, gates, and deliberately misleading passages that even the castle's own guards needed a week's worth of rations and a ball of string to find it. The lord sleeping inside could rest easy, knowing that any assassin would die of old age before locating the correct door. Of course, this labyrinthine genius came at a cost. Lords and ladies, knights and servants, all were equally susceptible to the castle's whims. It was not uncommon for a nobleman to set out for the chapel, and instead find himself in the kitchens, or for a maid to disappear into the bowels of the castle for days, emerging with wild eyes and a newfound distrust of architecture. Some historians speculate that the phrase "lost in thought" originated from the sheer amount of mental energy required to navigate these buildings without ending up in the dungeon by accident. And so, as the fire crackles low and the hour grows late, remember this. The next time you find yourself wandering your own home in the dark, bumping into furniture, take solace in the fact that at least your house wasn't designed to confuse invading armies. Unless, of course, you live in a castle, in which case, good luck. Chapter 2. The Curse of the Endless Corridor. If there was one thing more terrifying than an invading army scaling the castle walls, it was the desperate, bladder-clenching realization that you had no earthly idea where the privy was. Medieval castles were not designed with basic bodily functions in mind. No, they were designed to make even the most mundane human needs feel like an elaborate quest. And so the residents of these stone labyrinths often found themselves wandering for hours, clutching their robes in quiet desperation, praying to every saint they could remember that the next turn would reveal salvation, or at least a discreet corner. Take, for example, the infamous case of Sir Reginald of Brackenmore, a knight of considerable renown and, as it turned out, an even more considerable inability to navigate his own ancestral home. One evening, after a particularly indulgent feast involving an entire roast boar and several flagons of wine, Sir Reginald felt the familiar and urgent call of nature. Confident in his knowledge of the castle's layout, he strode out of the great hall only to realize, too late, that he had taken a wrong turn at the third tapestry of St. George slaying the dragon. What followed was a descent into madness. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, each one identical to the last, their torch-lit walls flickering with mocking shadows. He passed the same suit of armor 3 times, each time swearing it had not been there before. The castle, it seemed, was rearranging itself in real time, shifting its stones just enough to torment him. At one point, he stumbled upon a group of equally lost servants, all wandering in aimless circles, their expressions a mixture of resignation and existential dread. They nodded at one another in silent solidarity before continuing their separate, equally futile journeys. The privy, when he finally found it, hours later, by sheer divine intervention, was, of course, already occupied. The muffled groans from within suggested its current resident had also been on a quest of their own. Sir Reginald leaned against the wall, contemplating the cruel irony of it all, and made a mental note to commission a map. Or, failing that, to invest in a chamber pot he could carry at all times. This was not an isolated incident. Castle records from the period are filled with complaints about the impossibility of locating necessary facilities. Some lords, tired of the endless wandering, resorted to bribing servants to stand at key intersections and give directions. Others took more drastic measures, like the Baroness Elspeth of Blackmore, who famously installed a network of bells throughout her castle, each one corresponding to a different destination. And you see, Ares, ring the bell with the carved boar's head, and a servant would appear to guide you to the kitchens. Ring the one with the crossed swords, and you'd be escorted to the armory. The bell shaped like a chamber pot, naturally, was the most popular, but even these measures were not foolproof. Servants, being only human, sometimes got lost themselves. There are accounts of entire response teams wandering off into the depths of the castle, never to be seen again, their faint cries for help echoing through the stone passages for weeks. Some say their ghosts still linger, doomed to forever roam the corridors in search of an exit they will never find. And then there were the guests. Visitors to a castle were at a distinct disadvantage, lacking even the meager familiarity of the resident. Diplomatic missions often began with ambassadors being handed a hastily drawn map, its ink still smudged from the scribe's frantic scribbling. These maps were, without exception, wrong. Some were deliberate pranks, sketched by mischievous pages. Others were simply the product of honest confusion, their creators having long since given up on understanding the layout themselves. The most tragic victims of the endless corridor, however, were the castle's children. Many a noble child sent to retrieve a forgotten toy or summoned for bedtime would instead find themselves trapped in an endless loop of hallways, their tiny legs carrying them in circles, until exhaustion overtook them. It was not uncommon for nursemaids to organize search parties at dawn, only to find their charges curled up asleep in a disused garderobe, or worse, halfway up a forgotten tower, having mistaken it for the way to the nursery. Or, by the time the Renaissance rolled around, bringing with it a newfound appreciation for symmetry and sensible architecture, many castle dwellers wept with relief. No longer would they have to fear the shame of being discovered, Hours later, still wandering the halls in search of a place to relieve themselves. No longer would dinner invitations come with the unspoken caveat of bring your own chamber pot, just in case. And yet, for all its frustrations, there was something strangely poetic about the endless corridor. It was a reminder that even the grandest of human constructions were not immune to absurdity, that no matter how high the walls or how thick the gates, the most formidable enemy was often the building itself. So the next time you find yourself standing in your own home, staring blankly at a hallway that suddenly feels unfamiliar, take heart. You are participating in a grand historical tradition, one that stretches back centuries, uniting you with lords and servants alike in the timeless struggle against architecture's cruelest joke. Chapter 3. Secret Passages and Their Inconvenient Truths. If the architects of medieval castles took perverse pleasure in designing labyrinthine corridors, then the men who commissioned secret passages were outright sadists. These hidden tunnels, staircases, and doors were meant to provide discreet escape routes during sieges or clandestine movement for spies and lovers. Instead, they became elaborate traps, swallowing up the very people they were meant to serve and spitting them out days later, disoriented, dusty, and deeply regretting their life choices. Take the case of Lord Godfrey of Harrowmont, a man so paranoid about assassins that he ordered his castle riddled with secret passages, only to become the first victim of his own design. One evening, after a particularly tense council meeting and several goblets of fortified wine, he attempted to slip away unseen through a concealed door behind his throne. The door, operated by pulling a candlestick shaped like a snarling wolf, swung open smoothly. Lord Godfrey stepped inside, smug in his cleverness, until the door clicked shut behind him, plunging him into total darkness. He had forgotten the candle. What followed was a 5-hour ordeal, in which Lord Godfrey groped his way through a network of tunnels that seemed to branch in impossible directions. At one point, he stumbled into a forgotten armory, its rusted weapons clattering to the ground, in a cacophony that alerted half the castle to his predicament. By the time he emerged through a tapestry in the chapel, covered in cobwebs and muttering prayers, his council had already begun debating his successor. The problem with secret passages was that they were by necessity secret. Builders were often sworn to silence under penalty of death, which meant that the only person who knew the full layout was usually the original architect, who may or may not have been crushed by a falling block of stone during construction, taking his knowledge to the grave. Subsequent generations were left with half-remembered whispers, cryptic notes like "third stone left of the hearth," and, more often than not, false leads planted by mischievous ancestors. Lady Eleanor of Blackthorn famously discovered this the hard way. Upon inheriting her family's castle, she found a beautifully illustrated manuscript titled Jeux à Nobles, Guide to Secret Passages, complete with detailed diagrams. Delighted, she followed its instructions to the letter, only to trigger a mechanism that dumped her into the castle's wine cellar. Satiate, altered wine, and CC, and Aye. The manuscript, it turned out, had been penned by her great-uncle as an elaborate prank, its final page cheerfully noting, "If you've read this far, you're as gullible as your father." Even when secret passages were properly documented, they had a habit of evolving beyond their original purpose. A tunnel dug for smuggling goods might later be repurposed for smuggling lovers, then spies, then escaped prisoners, then, when all else failed, as a last resort shortcut for servants who were late with the soup. Each new use came with modifications. A door added here, a staircase removed there, until the original blueprint was as useless as a map of a spider's web after a hurricane. The servants, of course, suffered most. Charged with cleaning these hidden arteries of the castle, they ventured into the darkness with brooms and buckets, only to emerge days later, hollow-eyed and babbling about the whispering walls. Some claim to have found entire forgotten chambers, their furniture still draped in dust-covered sheets, as if waiting for occupants who had vanished centuries ago. Others spoke of drafts where there should be none, or the faint sound of footsteps echoing from passages that hadn't been used in living memory. Most learn to avoid the subject altogether, lest they be tasked with investigating. Then there were the guests, unwitting pawns in the castle's game of architectural hide-and-seek. A visiting dignitary, excusing himself from a banquet to admire the tapestries, might lean against what he thought was a sturdy wall, only to tumble into a pitch-black chute that deposited him into the kennel. Brides, arriving at their new homes, were often given a crash course in secret passage etiquette, which mostly consisted of, "Don't touch anything." Perhaps the greatest irony was that these passages, designed to protect their owners, often became their undoing. There were counts who fled invading forces through hidden tunnels, only to find themselves trapped in dead ends. There were barons who sneaked away to clandestine meetings, only to get lost and miss the rendezvous entirely. And there was at least one duke who, attempting to spy on his own council, became lodged in a narrow passageway and had to be extracted by a team of stonemasons, his dignity in tatters. By the time the Renaissance brought its love of order and symmetry, many nobles were more than happy to brick up their secret passages and pretend they had never existed. Better a castle that made sense than one that might swallow you whole for the crime of leaning on the wrong wall. And yet even now in the oldest castles, if you press your ear to the right stone or tug the right candlestick, you might still hear the faint echoes of generations past. The scuff of a lost lord's boots, the muttered curses of a servant who just wants to find the damn exit. Or if you listen very closely, the smug laughter of the architects, who knew exactly. For all their inconveniences, the secret passages endured as a testament to human ingenuity and human folly. After all, what is a castle but a monument to the idea that with enough stone and stubbornness, you can outwit your enemies, your family, and sometimes, if you're very unlucky, yourself. Chapter 4. The Lost Lords of History. If there was one thing medieval nobles loved more than feasting and declaring wars over petty insults, it was vanishing without a trace inside their own homes. The annals of history are littered with accounts of lords who stepped out for a moment, to inspect the armory, to retrieve a forgotten goblet, to relieve themselves in the middle of the night, only to disappear for hours, days, or in particularly embarrassing cases, long enough for succession disputes to begin. Consider the plight of Baron Alaric of Dunhold, a man so forgettable even his own castle seemed determined to erase him. One autumn evening, after retiring early from a feast, citing a mysterious pain he referred to only as the cabbage grievance, he wandered into the western wing of his fortress to retrieve a book from his private library. The book, a tedious treatise on crop rotation, was hardly worth the journey, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. The servants found his candle abandoned in the corridor the next morning, its wax long since hardened into a puddle of neglect. A search party was assembled, consisting of every able-bodied man in the castle, plus 2 very confused scullery maids who had been promised extra rations if they helped. They combed every inch of the fortress, from the highest towers to the deepest cellars, calling the Baron's name with increasing desperation. What they did not expect was to find him 3 days later, wedged into a disused chimney in the guest quarters, covered in soot and indignation. He had, he claimed, been pursuing a mysterious draught, a draught that turned out to be the chimney itself, which had somehow contracted around him like a stone serpent. His rescuers had to pour grease over him and pull him out like a stubborn cork from a bottle. The Baron never spoke of the incident again, though he developed a noticeable twitch whenever someone lit a fire. Then there was the curious case of Lady Isolde of Whitecliff, who vanished in the middle of her own wedding feast. One moment she was laughing at a minstrel's bawdy song, the next she had slipped away, ostensibly to adjust her headdress. When she failed to return after an hour, the groom, a particularly dense but well-connected duke, assumed she had gotten cold feet and began drunkenly challenging guests to duels in her honor. She was discovered the next morning in the castle's seldom used winter chapel, fast asleep under a pile of moth-eaten tapestries. She explained, taken a wrong turn into a servant's passage, tripped over a loose floorboard, and tumbled through a hidden panel into the chapel. Rather than attempt to navigate back through the castle's treacherous halls in the dark, she had decided to simply wait for daylight, and finding the tapestry surprisingly comfortable, had promptly dozed off. The wedding proceeded, though the groom spent the rest of the ceremony squinting at the walls as if they might swallow his bride again at any moment. But not all disappearances ended so harmlessly. Some lords were never found at all. The most infamous of these was Count Baldric of Wexford, a man whose self-importance was matched only by his terrible sense of direction. After storming out of a council meeting in a rage, someone had dared suggest his new tax on turnips was excessive. He vowed to retire to his chambers where at least the walls appreciate my genius. He was never seen again. Servance later reported hearing distant shouting from within the castle walls. Phrases like this is "Lunate, the way to the solar," and "Who builds a staircase that just east stops?" But by the time anyone thought to investigate, the voice had faded. Some claimed the Count had stumbled into a secret passage meant for smuggling and been sealed inside by a collapsing wall. Others whispered that the castle itself, tired of his bluster, had simply absorbed him. His successor, a pragmatic nephew with no patience for hidden architecture, had all known passages bricked up and installed a system of signposts, an innovation that earned him more praise than any of his actual policies. Even royalty was not immune. King Edward III, of some forgotten little kingdom, once vanished for 3 days while visiting a ducal estate, prompting panic among his retinue. The Duke, fearing execution, ordered every stone of the castle pried apart in search of the missing monarch. He was eventually found in the wine cellar, happily drunk and half-buried in a cask of elderberry wine, having mistaken a trapdoor for the entrance to his bedchamber. The incident was tactfully omitted from official records, though the king's subsequent decree that all trapdoors be clearly labeled "not a bed" suggests the experience left a mark. The most tragic disappearance, however, belonged to young Lord Percival of Amberley, a bookish boy more interested in poetry than swordsmanship. After being scolded by his father for moping about like a damp heron, he retreated into the castle's library, vowing to find a place where no one will bother me again. He succeeded. Years later, during renovations, workers broke through a false wall and found a small, snug chamber lined with books, and a skeleton curled peacefully in a chair, a volume of love sonnets, still clutched in its bony fingers. The room contained no door, no visible means of entry or exit. How Percival had found his way in, or whether he had ever tried to leave, remained a mystery. The castle's chaplain declared it a miracle, the servants called it the saddest thing they'd ever seen, and Percival's father, after a long silence, ordered the room sealed back up. Some things, it seemed, were better left lost. What unites all these tales is not just the absurdity of their circumstances, but the quiet horror of realizing that the place you call home might know its way around you better than you know your way around it. Castles, for all their grandeur, were never truly tamed. They remained half-wild things, full of secrets and surprises, and woe betide the lord who forgot that. So the next time you find yourself standing in a hallway, suddenly unsure of which door leads to the kitchen, take comfort. You are in good company, a company of vanished nobles, disoriented servants, and at least one wine-soaked king. History, it seems, has always had a sense of humor about those who assume they're in control, especially when there's a loose floorboard waiting to prove them wrong. Chapter 5. Servants, the unofficial navigators. In the grand hierarchy of castle life, where lords ruled and ladies schemed, there existed an unspoken truth known to every resident: the true masters of the keep were the servants. While nobles blustered about with their titles and heraldry, it was the lowly chambermaids, stable boys, and scullery workers who actually understood the building they all called home. They moved through its arteries like blood cells, carrying warmth and life to every forgotten corner, while their supposed superiors stumbled about like drunken bears in a maze. The education of a castle servant began on their first day, when they would be handed a bucket, a rag, and a look of pity from their fellow staff. There were no maps, no guided tours, just a series of increasingly dire warnings about which staircases creaked, which doors led nowhere, and which walls had a habit of swallowing people whole. The head housekeeper at Castle Blackmore was said to greet new hires with the cheerful phrase, "If you get lost, follow the rat droppings. They at least know where the food is." Young Tomkin the page boy learned this lesson the hard way when sent to deliver a message to the castle's eastern tower. After climbing what he swore was the correct spiral staircase, 3 times only to find himself back at the same moldy tapestry of St. George, he did what all sensible servants eventually did. He asked a passing maid for directions. She sighed, took him by the elbow, and led him through a series of passages Tomkin would later swear didn't exist, including a shortcut through a butler's pantry that required ducking under a precariously balanced tower of pewter plates. "The trick," she whispered as they emerged exactly where he needed to be, "is knowing which walls are liars." This underground network of servant knowledge became so vital that castles essentially developed 2 parallel layouts. The official one for nobility, full of grand halls and impressive dead ends, and the servants' version, a tangled web of hidden corridors, crawl spaces, and clever shortcuts that let them appear magically wherever need. A lord might wait 20 minutes for his wine to be refreshed, never realizing the servant had to travel half a mile through back passages to reach the kitchens and return. The most valued servants weren't the strongest or most comely, but those with an uncanny sense of direction. Old Nan at Wexford Keep could reportedly navigate the castle blindfolded after 50 years of service, her fingers tracing nearly invisible scratches in the stone that marked servant paths. When she finally passed, at the ripe age of 78, the entire household went into mourning, not just for her kind heart, but because 3 separate dinner parties got cold soup that week, as the younger staff kept taking wrong turns. Some servants turned this knowledge into quiet power. A clever footman at Harrenhal once saved his own neck by revealing he knew a secret route to the castle's hidden postern gate, information that made him suddenly invaluable when the lord's enemies laid siege. He was promptly promoted to butler and given an extra helping of pudding every Sunday. Other staff members were less altruistic with their knowledge. The kitchen staff at Amberley Castle ran a thriving black market in wayfinding assistance, charging terrified nobles exorbitant sums to guide them back to their chambers after dark. The servants' mastery of castle geography even birthed its own mythology. There were tales of particularly clever maids who had discovered whole abandoned wings their lords never knew existed, turning them into private retreats complete with pilfered furniture. One persistent legend spoke of a chambermaid at Wintermoor, who found a lost lord wandering the halls after 3 days, led him safely to his bedchamber, then demanded, and received, a year's wages as reward before promptly retiring to a farm. Perhaps the greatest testament to servant navigation came during the infamous Great Getting of 1372, when an entire contingent of visiting nobility became hopelessly disoriented during a feast at Stormhaven Castle. As lords and ladies wandered the halls in increasingly panicked clusters, it fell to the castle staff to quietly and efficiently retrieve them all, like sheepdogs rounding up particularly dim sheep. The incident was never spoken of openly among the nobility, though several servants reported finding unusually large tips under their pillows that night. This unspoken system finally met its match with the arrival of Renaissance ideas about architecture and, worse, transparency. As castles gave way to palaces with logical floor plans and, heaven forbid, signage, the servant class's greatest advantage began to fade. Though many tried to maintain the old ways, the head steward at Chateau de Brumet was said to have wept openly when the new owner installed door numbers. Progress could not be stopped. Yet even today, in the oldest remaining castles, if you watch closely you might still spot the signs. a maid taking a turn just a bit too sharply, a groundskeeper disappearing behind what appears to be a solid wall, a flicker of knowing smiles between staff members, as yet another tourist asks for directions to the bathroom. The walls may have stopped rearranging themselves, but some secrets are too delicious to ever fully disappear. After all, what's the point of service if you can't occasionally watch your betters walk face first into a tapestry? Chapter 6. Torches, Shadows, and False Landmarks. The medieval castle at night was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, not against invaders, but against its own inhabitants. What appeared during daylight as merely confusing transformed after sunset into a funhouse of deceptive shadows and treacherous light, where every flickering torch conspired to make navigation impossible, and every tapestry seemed to rearrange itself when no one was looking. Even the most familiar corridors became alien landscapes after dark, their landmarks shifting like sand in a storm. The problem began with the torches themselves. Positioned at irregular intervals along walls that already curved at nonsensical angles, they created pools of light separated by gulfs of darkness so profound they might as well have been bottomless pits. A resident making nighttime rounds would step confidently into one circle of illumination, only to emerge moments later, completely disoriented, their eyes struggling to adjust while their feet carried them inexorably towards some architectural ambush. The castle of Lord Godfrey of Harran March had one particular stretch known as the Gauntlet, 12 paces of total darkness between torches, where at least 3 visitors had reportedly turned around 180 degrees without realizing it, ending up back where they started and questioning their sanity. Then there were the shadows. With light coming from unpredictable angles, familiar objects became grotesque parodies of themselves. A simple suit of armor might appear as a lurking assassin, a coat rack as a waiting intruder, and one unfortunate incident at Wexford involved the Duchess attacking her own reflection in a polished shield, convinced it was an intruder wearing her face. The flickering torchlight gave everything an illusion of movement. Tapestries appeared to ripple when no breeze was present, and more than one guard had sworn he saw the stone gargoyles shift position when his back was turned. But the true architects of nighttime chaos were the tapestries themselves. Medieval nobility had an inexplicable fondness for decorating entire castles with near-identical woven scenes of hunting parties, biblical tableaus, and the ever-popular knight slaying something. After the 10th, nearly indistinguishable St. George versus the Dragon, even the most attentive resident would begin to doubt their memory. Lady Eleanor of Blackmore once spent an entire evening circling the same stretch of hallway, convinced each reappearance of a particular unicorn tapestry meant she was making progress. She was eventually found by a servant, sitting on the floor feeding crusts of bread, to what she insisted was the same damned unicorn every time. The problem worsened when well-meaning lords attempted solutions. Baron Otto the Well-Intentioned had all his torches replaced with expensive beeswax candles in identical brass holders, at precisely measured intervals. This simply meant the shadows now moved in perfect unison, creating a strobe-like effect that reportedly induced seizures in at least one visiting bishop. Another lord tried marking important turns with distinctive statues, until he discovered his staff kept moving them as pranks. The only reliable method, it seemed, was the one practiced by elderly servants, trailing one hand along the wall at all times, like a blind man reading Braille, fingers alert for the subtle differences in stonework that mark true landmarks. Even weather played its part. On windy nights, the drafty corridors would make torch flames dance wildly, causing shadows to leap and twist in mockery of anyone trying to navigate. Rain amplified the problem by making the outer walls sweat with condensation, which in turn made tapestries hang differently, subtly altering the appearance of familiar spaces. The infamous Night of 100 Lost Lords at Wintermarch Castle occurred during a particularly bad storm, when nearly every noble in residence managed to get turned around searching for the privy, resulting in a dozen confused aristocrats wandering the cellars until dawn. The introduction of candle lanterns in the 14th century helped somewhat, until castle dwellers discovered that carrying an open flame, while disoriented, created its own hazards. The Duke of Amberley's prized beard was reportedly singed down to stubble when he turned too quickly in a narrow passage, and the less said about the incident with the Countess's flammable farthingale, the better. Glass-enclosed lanterns solved these problems but created new ones by limiting light to a small circle round the bearer, turning all navigation into a slow, cautious probing forward like a man walking off a cliff in slow motion. Perhaps the most telling detail of all was the castle's nighttime soundtrack. The steady chorus of bumps, curses, and occasional crashes as residents collided with furniture they swore hadn't been there earlier. Servants learned to ignore the nocturnal yelps of their betters, just as they ignored the inevitable morning claims that the castle moved things around in the night. The wiser ones kept straight faces when some red-eyed noble insisted a particular chair or side table had definitely absolutely not been in that spot yesterday. By the time gaslighting began appearing in great houses, many castle residents wept with relief at the idea of being able to see more than 3 feet in front of their faces. Though some traditionalists complained the new lights ruined the ambience, most were too busy enjoying their newfound ability to find the privy on the first try to care. Yet even today, in those few remaining castles, still lit by torchlight for authenticity, you can still witness modern visitors experiencing that same timeless moment of doubt, the hesitation before a turn, the squint at a familiar tapestry suddenly rendered unfamiliar by flickering light, the dawning realization that perhaps their ancestors had better night vision than history credit. Or perhaps they just learned to hold it until morning. Chapter 7. The Great Hall Paradox. The Great Hall stood as the beating heart of every castle, the stage for feasts, the theater of politics, the grand display of a lord's power and hospitality. It was always the largest room, the most ornately decorated, the space designed to impress visitors and intimidate rivals. And yet, when urgently needed, whether for an impromptu council meeting or because someone had just spotted rats in the pantry, the Great Hall developed an uncanny ability to vanish like a mirage. This phenomenon became known as the Great Hall Paradox. The most important room in the castle was somehow always the hardest to find precisely when it mattered most. Lords would stride confidently from their chambers only to find themselves in the chapel. Servants, carrying overflowing platters, would round a familiar corner and discover a blank wall where an archway should be. Even the castle cats, normally infallible in their sense of direction, could be found meowing plaintively outside linen closets, having completely misjudged their path to the warmth of the hearth. The root of the problem lay in the hall's dual nature. During celebrations, it needed to be accessible to all, a grand, welcoming space visible from multiple approaches. In times of danger, those same approaches needed to be easily blocked or concealed. The result was an architectural schizophrenia that gave the Great Hall a mercurial personality. Staircases that led directly there during peacetime could be retracted or barricaded when enemies approached. Tapestries that concealed servant entrances would be drawn back for feasts, then replaced afterward by staff, who never seemed to position them quite the same way twice. Lord Edmund of Blackmore experienced this most embarrassingly during his own wedding feast. After excusing himself to attend to matters of state, and secretly sample the dessert wines, he found himself unable to relocate the hall despite it being mere yards from where he'd exited. His increasingly frantic search took him through the buttery, past the garderobes, and ultimately into the armory, where he was discovered by his bride-to-be an hour later, wine-stained and babbling about moving walls. The wedding proceeded, though the marriage contract notably included a clause requiring at least 2 servants to accompany the lord whenever he left the hall. Servants developed their own methods for overcoming the paradox. The most effective involved what they called the breadcrumb principle. though rather than literal breadcrumbs, which the castle dogs would happily consume, they used subtle markers invisible to noble eyes. A particular scratch on a door frame, an almost imperceptible discoloration of stone, or in the case of Wexford Castle, the strategic placement of certain unpleasant stains that nobles would instinctively avoid stepping near. These formed a web of clues that let servants navigate, even when the hall seemed determined to hide itself. The paradox reached its zenith during important events. There existed an unwritten law that the more critical the occasion, the more stubbornly the great hall would resist being found. Coronations, treaty signings, and especially royal visits seemed to trigger some deep architectural mischief in the stones themselves. When King Richard II visited Marwick Castle in 1391, the entire court spent 45 minutes wandering the outer bailey before a stable boy took pity and led them through what appeared to be a solid wall into the waiting hall. The king found this hilarious. His hosts did not. Some castle architects attempted solutions with mixed results. The most famous effort came from Sir Reginald of Foxford, who commissioned what he called the foolproof system. A series of colored banners leading from every major area of the castle directly to the Great Hall. This worked splendidly until the banners faded in sunlight, at which point the pale blue and pale green became indistinguishable, sending confused residents on endless loops between the chapel and the buttery. The system was abandoned after the castle chaplain, following what he thought was the liturgical blue banner, accidentally interrupted a rather private moment between the lord's daughter and the blacksmith's apprentice. Weather exacerbated the problem. On overcast days, when shadows played tricks and torchlight flickered uncertainly, even lifelong residents could walk past the hall's entrance 3 times without recognizing it. Winter brought its own challenges as tapestries were taken down for cleaning and replaced haphazardly, turning known paths into guesswork. The Great Blizzard of 1382 saw an entire Christmas feast delayed when both guests and hosts became trapped in separate wings of the castle, each group convinced the other was simply fashionably late. The introduction of printed maps in the 15th century seemed like salvation until nobles discovered that most castle cartographers took liberties with accuracy. Some maps were deliberately misleading for security purposes. Others were simply wrong, having been copied from even older, equally incorrect maps in a centuries-long game of architectural telephone. Lord Pembroke's famous map of certainty became a prized heirloom precisely because it was the only one in the family that didn't actively make navigation worse. Perhaps the most telling aspect of the Great Hall paradox was how thoroughly it permeated castle culture. The phrase "I'll meet you in the Great Hall" became less a promise and more a hopeful suggestion. Servants developed an entire vocabulary of euphemisms for hopelessly lost. Even the architecture acknowledged the phenomenon. Many castles featured waiting nooks near where the hall should be. Little alcoves with benches where disoriented visitors could rest until someone found them. In the end, the paradox revealed an essential truth about medieval life: that even the most powerful lord was ultimately at the mercy of his surroundings. The Great Hall might be the symbolic center of his domain, but finding it required either preternatural sense of direction or the humble willingness to ask for help. Many chose the former and spent hours wandering. The wiser ones chose the latter, though they rarely admitted it afterward. After all, what was nobility, if not the art of turning helplessness into a show of deliberate mystery? And so the Great Hall remained, as it always had been, the center of castle life that refused to behave like one. A place that was always exactly where you left it, except when it wasn't. A room that welcomed all comers, provided they could find the door, which, more often than not, they couldn't. Chapter 8. Architectural Amnesia. The true wonder of medieval castles wasn't their imposing walls or ingenious defenses, but how their architects managed to forget nearly everything about them within a single generation. Like elderly men misplacing their spectacles, castle builders displayed an astonishing capacity for losing critical knowledge about structures they themselves had designed. This chronic architectural amnesia transformed every fortress into a living puzzle, where each new addition was less an improvement and more a desperate attempt to compensate for something someone had forgotten. The problem began with the blueprints, or rather, the lack thereof. Wayfinding plans were often scratched onto wax tablets or parchment that would either melt in summer heat or become mouse banquets by winter. Even when properly preserved, these documents tended to be more artistic suggestion than technical guide, with proportions like "make it big as Harold's ego," and helpful notes such as "put the murder holes somewhere around here." The master mason at Dunwall Keep famously drew his plans in wine on a tavern table, which the serving maid dutifully cleaned before anyone could copy them down. What resulted were castles that grew like particularly confused mushrooms, sprouting towers where cellars were intended, and staircases that terminated abruptly in mid-air because someone forgot the next floor. Lord Pembroke's new banquet hall at Ambercrest Castle ended up 30 feet underground because the builders misremembered which level was supposed to be the main floor. Rather than admit their mistake, they simply told the Lord it was a revolutionary defensive design and billed him extra for the specially reinforced ceiling. This forgetfulness became hereditary. Each generation of builders inherited half-remembered truths and outright fabrications about the castle's structure. The mason who knew why the West Tower leaned precariously would perish in a suspicious scaffolding accident before explaining it to his apprentice. The carpenter who understood the peculiar notch in the Great Hall's beams would take that secret to his grave, along with the location of several crucial load-bearing walls. By the time a castle was a century old, its original purpose had been entirely obscured beneath layers of haphazard modifications and creative interpretations of what previous builders might have intended. The additions made during sieges were particularly egregious. Under threat of invasion, lords demanded rapid fortifications without considering where they should logically go. The result was a surge of hastily erected walls that bisected hallways, staircases that led directly into solid masonry, and arrow slits that provided defenders with magnificent views of interior stonework. Castle Thornwall's famous Lover's Leap Tower gained its name when a hasty wartime addition left its balcony 12 feet away from the adjacent battlement, creating a romantic but impractical crossing for clandestine rendezvous. Renovations intended to modernize older castles often made matters worse. Well-meaning lords would order the installation of fashionable large windows, only to discover too late that the walls couldn't support the weight. The Great Collapse of 1322 at Whitecliff Castle occurred when 3 separate generations of builders had each added their own floors without consulting the original plans, creating a sort of architectural lasagna that finally surrendered to gravity during a particularly vigorous dance performance. Servants developed an entire folklore around these mysterious constructions. There were tales of walls that sounded hollow when tapped but resisted all attempts to find hidden chambers, of doors that appeared in long familiar corridors overnight, of staircases that had more steps going down than they'd had going up. The kitchen staff at Blackmore Keep swore their pantry moved several feet north each winter, though whether this was due to settling foundations or particularly determined rats remained a subject of lively debate. The most perplexing additions were those that served no discernible purpose whatsoever. Castle after castle boasted tiny, inaccessible chambers, later dubbed the architect's revenge, mysteriously damp corridors called the Weeping Passage, and at least 3 separate instances of towers built without any doors at all. Lord Caxton of Vexhill grew so frustrated with one such inexplicable turret that he ordered it dismantled stone by stone, only for the workers to discover it was the only thing preventing the entire west wing from sliding into the moat. Attempts to rectify these problems often compounded them. When Lady Isolde of Marwick hired a renowned architect to make sense of this mess, his solution was to build an entirely new wing rather than untangle the old one. This new addition promptly developed its own quirks, including a hallway that grew noticeably narrower along its length and a garderobe that emptied directly into the chapel's holy water font. The original architect disappeared midway through construction, leaving behind only a note that read, "Some things man was not meant to understand." Even royal castles weren't immune. Westminster Palace contained so many contradictory additions by the 14th century that visiting nobles were given guided tours to prevent international incidents. The famous painted chamber earned its name not from its elaborate decorations, but from the frustrated markings left by generations of lost courtiers attempting to map their way out. The true tragedy of architectural amnesia was that it erased not just practicality, but history itself. Secret passages were walled up by builders who forgot they existed, then rediscovered centuries later by accident. Ancient defensive features were dismantled because no one remembered their purpose, only for invaders to exploit exactly those weaknesses. The Earl of Wessex's famed unsinkable castle moat turned out to have been designed to flood certain tunnels during attacks, a fact remembered just in time to stop his great-grandson from draining it to improve the smell. By the Renaissance, when scholars began properly documenting architectural principles, they were horrified to discover how much knowledge had been lost. The great architect Palladio nearly wept upon examining Warwick Castle's floor plans, declaring them a crime against geometry and common sense. Yet even his attempts to bring order to castle design couldn't entirely erase centuries of creative forgetfulness. The palaces that replaced medieval fortresses might have boasted symmetry and logic, but they lacked that peculiar charm of a building that had grown organically wrong in a dozen different ways. Perhaps that's why even today we find these ancient piles of contradictory stonework so endearing. They stand as monuments not just to medieval power, but to human fallibility, to the fact that even our grandest creations are eventually shaped as much by what we've forgotten as by what we intended. And if you listen closely to their crooked halls, you can still hear the ghosts of long-dead builders muttering, "I'm sure there was a reason for this." Chapter 9. The Haunting of the Never-Ending Staircase. Of all the architectural nightmares medieval castles produced, none tormented residents quite like the infamous never-ending staircase of Blackthorn Keep. What began as a simple spiral flight between the third-floor armory and the fourth-floor chapel gradually became something far more sinister. A structure that seemed to exist just beyond the edge of physical possibility, where the normal rules of space and time held no sway. The first recorded victim was Sir Godfrey, the castle's master-at-arms, who in 1342 set out to inspect the armory before supper and arrived at dinner 3 days later with no memory of where he'd been. His boots were worn nearly through the soles, his beard had grown noticeably, and tucked in his belt was a small wooden doll none of the servants recognized. When questioned about his absence, he could only mutter about the steps that kept going before demanding strong drink and refusing to speak of it further. Over the next century, the staircase developed its own mythology among castle staff. New servants were warned never to count steps while ascending, lest they reach numbers no earthly staircase should contain. The braver maids would dare each other to run up quickly without looking at their feet, though none ever completed more than 2 full rotations before losing their nerve and retreating. Even the castle cats, normally indifferent to human concerns, would sit at the base staring upwards with their tails twitching, as if watching something invisible ascend into darkness. The staircase's most infamous property was its apparent ability to change length depending on who climbed it and why. A servant delivering clean linens to the chapel might make the journey in 20 steps with no difficulty. That same servant sent later to retrieve forgotten linens could climb 50 steps without reaching the top. Lord Blackthorn's steward kept meticulous records proving the staircase added approximately 7 steps for every urgent message that needed delivering, and subtracted steps when wine barrels were being carried up for feasts. Though whether this was supernatural mischief or clever servants remained an open question. In 1411, the staircase claimed its most illustrious victim when Bishop Guillaume of Avignon came to inspect the castle chapel. After beginning his ascent following evening vespers, he was found the next morning sleeping in a third-floor broom closet with no memory of how he got there. His ceremonial robes were inside out, his shoes were on the wrong feet, and in his pocket was a single playing card, the Three of Cups, from a deck no one in the castle owned. The official explanation involved overwork and strong sacramental wine, but the bishop's private correspondence revealed he'd subsequently commissioned 3 exorcisms by mail. The staircase's malevolence seemed particularly focused on the castle's noble family. Young Lady Eleanor claimed to have reached a non-existent 5th floor, where all the portraits had their eyes scratched out. Her brother Lord Thomas once disappeared for a week, only to be found curled asleep in the stairwell's shadows, insisting he'd only stepped away to use the privy hours before. The family's lowest moment came when visiting the Holy Roman Emperor was led up the staircase by an over-eager butler and emerged 2 hours later through a first-floor pantry, his imperial dignity somewhat compromised by the flower dusts covering his ceremonial robes. Attempts to study or modify the staircase invariably ended poorly. When Master Mason Hugh of York was hired to investigate, he emerged from his survey white as chalk and immediately left the castle without collecting his pay. His unfinished notes included the phrase, "The turns don't sum right," and a sketch of what appeared to be an Ouroboros wrapped around a plumb line. Subsequent builders who tried to alter the staircase found their measurements never matched twice. Their plumb lines sagged at impossible angles, and their tools went missing with alarming frequency. Servants developed elaborate rituals to appease whatever spirits haunted the stairs. They left offerings of bread and salt on the landing every full moon, avoided speaking above a whisper within 20 paces of it, and most importantly, never ascended after dark unless absolutely necessary. The few who broke this rule told stories of feeling unseen hands brush their necks, of hearing footsteps continuing above them long after they'd stopped climbing, of finding fresh scratches on the stone walls that hadn't been there moments before. The staircase's true nature may have been revealed during the Great Inventory of 1492, when a clerk discovered an ancient parchment wedged between stones in the foundation. The crumbling document told of a previous castle on the site whose mad lord had walled up 12 troubadours alive in a tower for singing off-key. Their final song, the parchment claimed, had been about the steps between earth and sky, a lyric that took on disturbing new meaning when the clerk realized the current staircase occupied exactly where that tower would have stood. Modern architects who have examined the staircase, those who could be persuaded to approach it, note several peculiar features. The spiral runs counterclockwise against standard defensive design, putting ascending attackers at no particular disadvantage. The steps vary slightly in height in a pattern some claim matches the lunar cycle. And most unsettling of all, though the staircase clearly connects only 2 floors, there are shadows in the stonework suggesting additional landings that shouldn't exist. Today, the staircase remains Blackthorn Keep's most infamous feature, though the current owners have taken to calling it the irregular stair in their brochures. Visitors report varying experiences. Some climb it without incident. Others swear they passed the same arrow slit 3 times, and a few stubbornly insist they glimpsed another climber just around the curve ahead, though no one else was in the castle at the time. No one else was in the castle at the time. The staff have learned not to comment, though they still perform those small rituals with bread and salt when the moon is full. After all, as the old saying goes, it's not paranoia if the staircase really is watching you back. Chapter 10. The Lost Guest Dilemma. Of all the social catastrophes that could befall a medieval noble household, none proved more reliably entertaining than the phenomenon of visiting guests who entered a castle as honored visitors and emerged days later as disheveled phantoms of their former selves, having spent the intervening time wandering the halls in increasingly desperate circles. This peculiar form of hospitality failure became so common that many castles maintained standing search parties and guest recovery kits containing fresh clothing, strong drink, and smelling salts for when the inevitable finally occurred. The problem stemmed from a perfect storm of medieval castle design. Identical-looking corridors that changed subtly depending on the time of day. Staircases that led to different floors depending on which foot you started climbing with, and an aristocratic aversion to practical signage that might imply their guests couldn't memorize a simple floor plan. The Earl of Wessex famously greeted visitors with the cheerful warning, "Should you become lost, simply remain where you are, and someone will eventually trip over you," which worked splendidly until 3 separate guests took him at his word, and were discovered months later in increasingly remote antechambers, having taken up whittling to pass the time. The experience followed a predictable arc. A guest would excuse themselves from dinner to freshen up or take some air, confidently striding forth into the castle's depths, with the absolute certainty that anyone could find their way back to a hall where several hundred people were currently roasting an entire ox. 15 minutes later, they'd realize with dawning horror that all the tapestries looked identical. The torches cast confusing shadows, and the faint strains of minstrel music seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. By the hour mark, most resorted to knocking cautiously on doors, praying they wouldn't accidentally interrupt the Lord's privy time again. Servants developed an entire classification system for lost guests. Wanderers moved constantly, leaving a trail of open doors and disturbed furniture like a particularly well-dressed hurricane. Stillwater chose a promising-looking corridor and remained there indefinitely, hoping civilization would eventually come to them. Askenders invariably climbed staircases, leading to the castle's upper reaches where they'd be found days later, waving desperately from tower windows. The rarest and most prized were trespassers, who somehow penetrated into areas even the family rarely visited, like the legendary Duke of Northumberland, who was discovered in the cistern room trying to bribe a scullery maid for directions back to the 14th century. The recovery process became an art form. Experienced servants knew better than to immediately reveal they'd found a missing guest, as the noble in question would invariably insist they were exactly where they meant to be. Instead, the approved technique was to appear coincidentally while carrying something the guest might plausibly want: a goblet of wine, a warm cloak, a map they just happened to have handy. The castle chaplain at Harrenhal perfected a technique of divine intervention, where he'd round a corner while loudly thanking God for putting him in the right place to help the lost soul before him, thus preserving their dignity through what was clearly heavenly will rather than human incompetence. Some guests leaned into their predicament with remarkable grace. The French ambassador to Castle Blackmore spent 3 days lost in the wine cellars and emerged with detailed tasting notes and a business proposition for the Lord's vintner. Lady Eleanor of York turned her 2-day disappearance into a spiritual retreat, converting a disused chapel into her temporary quarters and emerging with what she claimed were stigmata, though the castle physician privately diagnosed them as bedbug bites. The most impressive was undoubtedly Baron von Steuben, who got lost for a week, discovered the castle's neglected library, and emerged having written a complete history of the family lineage that was immediately adopted as official record despite containing several glaring inaccuracies and one entirely fabricated great-aunt. Not all took it so well. The Bishop of Norwich's infamous lost weekend at Amberley Castle culminated in him excommunicating an entire wing of the building, a spiritual censure that remarkably seemed to improve the draft situation. Young Lord Pembroke was found after 48 hours curled in a linen closet, composing what he called revenge poetry about the architect's mother. And the less said about the incident with the Venetian trade delegation and the angry swan, the better. Though the castle's official chronicle does note it was the first time in history someone attempted to pay ransom in silk slippers. Castle staff maintained that the true culprit wasn't poor design, but the guests' own stubbornness. Time and again, a servant would offer guidance only to be waved off by a noble insisting they knew exactly where they were going. The castle baker at Wintermarch kept a tally of how many times he'd watched guests confidently stride directly past the great hall entrance, their ears practically touching the riot of feast noises within, while muttering about getting one's bearings. His record stood at 7 passes before intervention. The problem became so widespread that some enterprising nobles turned it into entertainment. The Earl of Somerset installed particularly comfortable benches at strategic points where guests were likely to get lost, along with writing materials so they could compose their last wills while waiting for rescue. Lord Blackthorne took bets among his household on how long new visitors would remain missing, with proceeds going to the servants who found them. And the famously eccentric Duke of Burgundy deliberately designed his castle with misleading corridors that all eventually led to a central wine cellar, ensuring even the most directionally challenged guest would consider their ordeal a rousing success. By the dawn of the Renaissance, as castles gave way to more sensibly designed palaces, the lost guest phenomenon dwindled, much to the disappointment of servants who'd grown fond of the tips offered by grateful if embarrassed visitors. Yet even today, in those few remaining castles still operating as residences, stories persist of dinner guests who excuse themselves never to return, of faint cries for help echoing from behind wainscoting, of well-dressed figures glimpsed through ancient arrow slits, peering out hopefully at the modern world below. Whether ghosts or particularly persistent ancestors of those long-ago lost visitors remains unclear, though the current staff at Warwick Castle swear they still occasionally find wine glasses drained and chairs moved in the deepest corridors, as if someone very old-fashioned had only just stepped away. Chapter 11. Maps that made things worse. In the grand tradition of solutions creating entirely new problems, medieval castle maps stood as a singular achievement in making bad situations spectacularly worse. These cartographic catastrophes ranged from comically inaccurate to actively treacherous, turning what should have been navigational aids into elaborate practical jokes played across centuries. A lord consulting his castle's floor plan was as likely to find the kitchens as he was to accidentally invade Wales, and many learned the hard way that sometimes it was better to simply wander aimlessly and hope for the best. The problems began with the map makers themselves, usually monks who had never set foot in the castle they were documenting. Working from second-hand descriptions and the occasional drunken sketch from a visiting noble, these scribes produced documents that bore only passing resemblance to reality. The famous Mappa Infuriata of Castle Blackmore showed the Great Hall in 5 different locations simultaneously, helpfully labeled here, probably, perhaps here, not this bit, certainly, and 2 simply marked with ominous question marks. When the actual builder attempted to follow this guidance, he created what became known as the Hall of Echoing Confusion, where dinner conversations repeated endlessly until they blended into a sort of audible stew that servants claimed sometimes predicted the weather. Even when maps were created by those familiar with the castle, security concerns rendered them useless to all but cryptographers. Lords fearful of spies or invading forces intentionally included false passages, trapdoors that didn't exist, and entirely fictional wings that later builders would puzzlingly attempt to construct. The Count of Montefiore's prized defensive map included so many red herrings that when actual invaders stole it, they spent 3 weeks searching for a non-existent underground river before giving up in frustration. The Count failed to anticipate that his own heirs would rely on the same document, leading to the infamous drowning cellars incident where an entire vintage was lost probing for waterways that were literally just ink on parchment. Scale proved another insurmountable challenge. Medieval mapmakers worked on the principle of important things are big, resulting in floor plans where the Lord's bedchamber might occupy half the page, while entire wings were compressed into a corner, with the notation here, "Be kitchens, we think." The legendary Bloom map of Winchester showed the chapel at approximately 3 times its actual size, while representing the entire eastern defensive wall, as a squiggly line that could have been a wall, a river, or the cartographer pausing for lunch. When the castle's chaplain demanded an explanation for why his domain appeared to be larger than the keep itself, the mapmaker reportedly shrugged and said, God's house should be grand, no? Materials didn't help. Parchment stretched and shrank with humidity, causing corridors to expand and contract like the castle was breathing. Ink ran in rain or when touched by sweaty fingers, creating phantom doorways where only solid stone existed. The Earl of Warwick's prized velvet map became a breeding ground for moths that selectively ate certain passages, resulting in several unfortunate incidents where guests followed deliciously fragrant paths straight into dead ends. The low point came when a visiting diplomat became trapped in what the map showed as a thoroughfare, but was in reality a particularly deep garderobe shaft, an international incident that nearly sparked a war until everyone agreed never to speak of it again. The introduction of printed maps in the 15th century only amplified the chaos. Errors that might have been confined to a single manuscript could now proliferate across an entire print run, with copies made from copies until the original mistakes bred new generations of inaccuracies. Castle Thornhill's official visitor's map showed the location of the infamous murder tower, so named for its use during a particularly nasty succession dispute, as the chapel, leading to several awkward moments when pilgrims arrived for prayer and found themselves staring at blood-stained torture devices instead of altars. The printer's attempts to correct this simply inverted the problem, sending actual prisoners to the chapel where they happily joined Vespers before anyone noticed. Some maps fell victim to wishful thinking. The famous lavender map of Château de Brumet showed extensive pleasure gardens that existed only in the Lord's imagination, their carefully inked pathways and fountains taunting generations of gardeners who attempted to make them real. Lord Pembroke's map of future glory depicted an entire additional wing that would never be built, though visitors occasionally reported glimpsing its ghostly outlines on foggy mornings or after particularly strong ale. Savants developed their own underground trade in accurate maps, drawn on scraps of cloth or carved into vegetable peelings. These turnip charts were passed furtively among staff and could fetch a year's wages on the black market. When Lady Eleanor discovered her chambermaid selling remarkably accurate maps to visiting nobles, she initially flew into a rage, until realizing the profits could fund her tapestry collection, at which point she established a royal monopoly and standardized pricing. The resulting maid's maps became prized possessions, though their tendency to include unflattering commentary about various nobles' hygiene habits occasionally caused diplomatic incidents. The final indignity came when scholars began studying these maps, centuries later. Historians wrote entire theses about the symbolic representation of space in medieval cartography, before realizing the artists were just bad at perspective. Architects wept over innovative defensive deceptions that were in reality a monk getting drunk on ink fumes. And at least one modern castle guide still leads tourists on the Phantom Corridor tour, based entirely on a 14th century mapmaker's doodle of what might have been a hallway, or possibly a very elongated horse. Perhaps the greatest testament to these maps' failure was how often they were simply abandoned in frustration. Dozens survive today with wine stains at crucial junctions, suggesting their owners had given up and used them as coasters. Others bear angry marginalia. Lies, all lies. This is not where the privy is, and one particularly plaintive, why did father think this would help? The most telling may be the Wexford Scroll, which after 3 feet of increasingly inaccurate corridors, simply ends with the words, "Oh, just ask a servant." In the end, these maps stand as monuments not to knowledge, but to human stubbornness, the determination to make sense of something fundamentally senseless. They remind us that sometimes the best guide is experience, that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, and that if several generations of your ancestors failed to find the kitchen using a particular document, perhaps you should consider simply following the smell of roast mutton instead. Chapter 12. The Dungeon That Wasn't. Medieval castles contained many legitimate dungeons, dark, damp holes where enemies of the crown languished in deserved misery. But far more numerous were the accidental prisons, rooms and chambers throughout the castle that became impromptu cells simply because their doors had been designed by architects who apparently never considered people might want to leave. These unintentional oubliettes trapped everyone from visiting bishops to the castle cats, creating a rotating population of temporary prisoners who passed their confinement composing angry ballads, or in the case of the cats, producing increasingly insistent offspring. The problem stemmed from a peculiar design philosophy that assumed doors only needed to open one way. Defensive gates were built to withstand assault from without, forgetting that sometimes people inside might also wish to exit. Storage rooms were secured against thieving servants, without considering that legitimate users might someday find themselves on the wrong side of their own locks. The infamous butler's pantry incident at Wexford Castle saw the entire household staff trapped for 3 days because the heavy oak door could only be opened from the bustling kitchen side, while the butler who knew the trick lay drunk in the stables after discovering the lord's private wine reserve. Nobility proved particularly susceptible to these architectural traps. Accustomed to servants handling doors for them, many never developed the basic survival skill of checking whether a room could actually be escaped. Lord Pembroke spent the night of his daughter's wedding locked in a linen closet because the decorative iron latch only worked from the hallway side. His increasingly panicked shouts were mistaken for enthusiastic participation in the bawdy wedding psalms echoing through the castle, and he was only discovered at dawn when a maid came to fetch fresh tablecloths for breakfast. The incident might have been forgotten had he not emerged wearing nothing but a determined expression and several yards of Venetian lace he'd fashioned into makeshift clothing during his confinement. The castle chapel at Blackmore Keep became an unintentional prison, so often that the bishop installed a small writing desk and stocked the vestry with emergency rations. At least 7 weddings were nearly ruined when grooms, attempting to compose last-minute vows in solitude, found themselves unable to rejoin their own ceremonies. The record for longest accidental chapel confinement went to Brother Edmund, who entered to light candles for evening vespers, and emerged during Christmas Mass 3 months later, having survived on communion wafers and the occasional sympathetic mouse. His first words upon release, "God clearly wished me to contemplate my sins at length," were later revealed to be a polite translation of what he'd actually muttered under his breath. Servants developed an entire classification system for these traps. Squealers were doors that could be heard from high-traffic areas, ensuring relatively quick rescue. Mufflers were rooms like the winter pantry or wool storage where cries went unheard beneath layers of insulation. The dreaded ghost rooms were spaces so remote that victims could shout for days before anyone passed nearby, by which time they'd usually resigned themselves to starting new lives as eccentric hermits. The castle carpenter at Harrenhal kept meticulous records of these spaces, not to fix them but to ensure at least one person knew where to send search parties when the inevitable occurred. Some architectural traps became legendary. The Count's water closet at Montefiore Castle trapped so many visiting nobles that it developed its own rescue protocol, involving a dedicated crowbar kept on a silk pillow nearby. The silent stair at Ambercrest would swing shut behind climbers, leaving them stranded on a narrow ledge between floors until someone happened to use the servants' passage running parallel. And the infamous Maiden's Bower at Thornhill, supposedly a romantic retreat for noble daughters, saw so many accidental imprisonments that it was eventually repurposed as an actual dungeon, saving guards the trouble of transporting prisoners to more secure cells. The problem reached its zenith during sieges, when every door was barred and every passage guarded. Well-meaning defenders regularly found themselves trapped in their own defensive positions, leading to the curious spectacle of attackers discovering their enemies already imprisoned by their castle's architecture. During the siege of Wexford in 1382, invading forces broke through the outer wall only to find half the garrison locked in various towers and storerooms, pounding pitifully on doors that could only be opened from the now enemy-controlled corridors outside. The resulting ceasefire, while everyone sorted out who was supposed to be where, remains history's only recorded battle interrupted by architectural confusion. Attempts to solve the problem often made matters worse. When Lord Caxton installed bells in every problematic room, the constant ringing drove the household mad until they began ignoring them altogether, leading to the tragicomic situation of servants walking past clearly audible bells, while someone desperate pounded just inches away on the other side of a door. The Duke of Burgundy's solution of installing escape tunnels from every room simply created a secondary maze beneath the castle, where people now got doubly lost. And the less said about Earl Roland's experiment with trained rescue ferrets, the better, though the castle chaplain did note a dramatic increase in religious fervor following their introduction. The true tragedy of these accidental dungeons was how they blurred the line between prisoner and guest. A visiting diplomat might enter a seemingly innocuous chamber, only to find himself trapped with nothing but his thoughts, and the growing realization that his hosts might not have actually intended this, but weren't exactly rushing to fix it either. Servants whispered of nobles who'd gone to punish someone only to become trapped alongside them, leading to awkward truces and occasionally surprising friendships forged through shared confinement. The castle records at Wintermarch note one particularly odd week when the Lord, his least favorite cousin, and a chicken meant for that night's supper all occupied the same stuck-door predicament for 36 hours, emerging with what appeared to be a complex emotional bond. By the Renaissance, as castles gave way to palaces with properly functioning doors, these accidental prisons faded from memory, though echoes remain in our language. When we speak of being locked into decisions or relationships, when we describe situations with no way out, we unknowingly reference those long-ago nobles and servants who discovered with dawning horror that their own homes could turn against them. And if you listen very closely in the oldest castles, behind the thickest doors, you might still hear the faint scratches of those who came before, not carving pleas for rescue, but leaving behind the more universal message: don't let the door hit you on the way in. Chapter 13. The Ghosts Who Got Lost Too. If medieval castles proved baffling for the living, they became absolute purgatory for the dead. The same architectural quirks that left nobles wandering in circles for hours trapped spirits in endless spectral confusion, turning what should have been dignified hauntings into phantom farces. Ghosts who intended to stalk moonlit corridors or wail beneath bedchamber windows instead found themselves rattling doorknobs in abandoned larders or moaning plaintively at the backs of tapestries where no one would ever hear them. The afterlife, it seemed, didn't include a map. The problem was particularly acute for those ghosts attempting to complete unfinished business. Lady Eleanor of Blackmore, murdered by her husband in 1347, spent the next 2 centuries trying to reach the Great Hall to expose his crime. Unfortunately, the secret passage he'd used in life had been walled up during renovations, leaving her eternally pacing a now non-existent corridor that occasionally overlapped with the castle's current wine cellar. Visitors reported feeling an unnatural chill and hearing what sounded like frustrated spectral cursing whenever they selected particularly good vintages. Other ghosts fell victim to architectural changes that altered their traditional haunting grounds. The Grey Monk of Wexford Castle, who in life had faithfully maintained the chapel candles, continued his rounds even after death, unaware that his beloved chapel had been relocated during expansion. His ghostly footsteps could still be heard climbing the staircase that now led to the garderobes, resulting in multiple reports of haunted privies, where users swore they felt an invisible presence judging their efforts. The current lord eventually installed a small devotional candle in the water closet just in case, which seemed to placate the ghost slightly, though it still sighed dramatically whenever someone lingered too long with a book. Some spirits became trapped in recursive hauntings, doomed to repeat actions that no longer made sense in the altered castle. The tragic romance of the Weeping Maiden involved her waiting eternally at what had once been a moonlit balcony rendezvous spot, now an interior linen closet. Servants grew accustomed to finding their folded sheets mysteriously rumpled each morning, as if someone had been sitting on them while sighing dramatically about unrequited love. When a clever maid pinned up a note suggesting the maiden try the new East Wing balcony, the hauntings briefly stopped, until the ghost apparently got lost again and wound up moaning near the butter churn instead. The castle's most famous ghostly resident, The headless huntsman fared particularly poorly. His intended dramatic gallop through the great hall became a sad, clip-clopping circuit of what was now a broom closet. The sound of his spectral steed reduced to faint shuffling noises that servants initially mistook for rats. His appearances became so pathetic that the household eventually took pity and widened the closet door slightly, allowing at least part of his horse to emerge dramatically before getting stuck again. The huntsman seemed to appreciate the effort, leaving occasional ghostly apples for the staff in what might have been attempted gratitude or possibly more haunting confusion. Savants developed an entire folklore around these trapped spirits. New staff were warned about the whistling ghost who thought he was still patrolling the battlements, now the nursery, and would shush children during naps. The kitchen help kept a spare place setting for old crusty Walter, the ghost of a medieval baker who stubbornly continued trying to remove loaves from an oven that had been moved in 1412. And everyone knew not to remark upon the faint sobbing coming from inside the south wall, the remains of a long-forgotten secret passage, where some poor soul had gotten trapped for eternity, still trying to find the release mechanism. Living residents took a perverse comfort in these incompetent hauntings. A lord might wake to eerie moans outside his chamber, only to realize it was just poor Lady Constance again, trying to locate the stairwell that had been removed after her death. Children told stories of the lost ghost games, where they'd follow faint phantom sounds through the castle, betting on which dead resident would appear where. And when strange noises echoed through the halls at night, servants would shrug and say, "Just the ghosts being ghosts," which covered everything from actual hauntings to mice to the occasional drunk noble trying to find his way back from the privy. Some particularly enterprising spirits adapted to their predicament. The ghost of a mischievous page boy took to moving objects to more logical locations, finally putting his afterlife to good use after driving the living mad for centuries by hiding their belongings. The specter of a long-dead castle architect could sometimes be seen mournfully studying the newer additions, shaking his translucent head at the modifications. And at least one ghostly maid had taken up the task of tidying unused rooms. Her faint humming heard as she straightened sheets no one had slept in for generations. The castle's current residents eventually developed a system of ghost maintenance, small acts of consideration for their spectral roommates. Savants would occasionally open doors that seemed to trouble particular spirits, allowing them momentary escape from their recursive hauntings. The chaplain included the castle ghosts in his prayers, though tactfully avoided mentioning how embarrassing their haunting performances were. And when the great hall was rearranged for feasts, someone always made sure to leave a clear path for the headless huntsman's horse, even if it meant sacrificing prime seating arrangements. Perhaps the most telling detail was how these lost ghosts became part of the castle's living history. Their failed hauntings were recorded alongside births and marriages in the family chronicles. Their favorite wandering spots became part of official tours. And when particularly loud spectral moaning echoed through the halls, residents would call out helpful directions, then wait patiently to see if the ghost managed to find its way this time. After all, they reasoned, eternity was a long time to be lost. Better to lend a hand when possible, even if that hand passed right through your spectral neighbor's incorporeal form. In the end, these confused spirits served as the castle's most honest historians, eternal reminders that no one, not even the dead, had ever truly mastered its labyrinthine halls. Their frustrated footsteps and muffled curses echoed the same complaints once uttered by living residents, creating a peculiar continuity between past and present. And if you listen very carefully on quiet nights, you might hear the faint but unmistakable sound of spectral laughter, as yet another ghost realizes it's been haunting the wrong room for 3 centuries. Chapter 14. The Kitchen That Moved. There existed in every castle an eternal struggle more dire than any siege. The battle to deliver hot food from kitchen to table. While lords and ladies complained of chilled soups and congealed meats, generations of red-faced servants sprinted through twisting corridors, desperately trying to remember which turn led to the dining hall this time. The kitchen remained stationary in theory, Yet in practice it seemed to relocate itself farther away with each passing feast, as if some architectural trickster god took delight in watching platters of perfectly roasted pheasant transform into sad lumps of grease. The problem began with medieval dining fashion, which demanded separate kitchens to keep smoke and smells away from noble nostrils. What began as sensible distancing soon became absurd as castles expanded without logic. At Wexford Keep, the kitchen ended up 3 vertical floors and a quarter-mile horizontal dash from the Great Hall, necessitating meals be prepared hours early and kept warm through increasingly creative methods. The castle's hot pants system, where fleet-footed pages wore specially insulated breeches to carry dishes against their bare thighs, became legendary, as did the peculiar hopping gait they all developed by age 20. Menus evolved around dishes that traveled well. Soups thickened to pudding consistency to prevent sloshing. Meats roasted to near leather toughness to survive the journey. Delicate pastries were abandoned entirely after the great tart collapse of 1372, when 7 cherry confections met their demise against an unexpected turn in the butler's passage. The castle chef at Blackmore Keep famously scrawled in his recipe book, "Take 1 part flour, 2 parts honey, and pray to Saint Martha of housekeeping that it arrives intact." Servants developed elaborate relay systems to combat the distance. At Ambercrest Castle, dishes passed through 12 pairs of hands along a carefully timed route. The staff called the butter highway, for how often they greased door frames to shave precious seconds. The system worked splendidly until one unfortunate day, when a lazy scullery maid took a shortcut through the chapel, resulting in an entire suckling pig being blessed by a confused bishop before anyone noticed. Temperature maintenance became an art form. Silver domes invented to keep food hot doubled as defensive weapons when hurled in frustration. One innovative butler at Thornhill Castle developed a system of heated stones placed beneath serving platters, which worked beautifully until an overeager page loaded too many and set the Lord's tablecloth smoldering during a state dinner. The resulting flaming gravy incident became castle legend, though diplomatic letters from the visiting Spanish ambassador discreetly omitted any mention of servants beating out the flames with their decorative livery caps. The true nightmare arrived with winter. Stone corridors already cold in summer became glacial moats separating kitchen from diners. Servants at Wintermarch Keep took to wrapping dishes in their own cloaks, leading to the peculiar sight of half-frozen pages presenting roast fowl while shivering in nothing but their under-tunics. The castle's records note with grim humor that December feasts required 2 chickens, prepared for everyone served, 1 for the table, 1 sacrificed to the hallway gods. Some nobles attempted solutions with typical lack of practicality. Lord Pembroke installed a system of pulleys and baskets to transport food vertically between floors, forgetting that gravy obeys no mechanical law. The Duke of Burgundy hired Italian engineers to design a heated serving cart, which got stuck on the castle's irregular steps during its maiden voyage, creating what servants called the world's most expensive buffet table. The low point came when Baron von Steuben imported what he claimed was a self-warming platter from the Orient, which turned out to be a poorly disguised chamber pot that made all food taste faintly of lavender and regret. The kitchen staff's most ingenious adaptation was the development of travel-ready cuisine. Meats were cooked well past doneness so they'd merely dry out rather than spoil during transit. Gravies thickened to near-solid consistency could be chiseled back to liquid at table. Vegetables abandoned all pretense of crispness and embraced their destiny as warm mush. The pinnacle came with castle pudding, a dessert so dense it could survive being dropped from the battlements, but whether anyone actually wanted to eat it remained questionable. As the head cook at Harrenhal famously declared while prying one from its mold, "If the Lord wants soufflé, he can bloody well dine in the scullery." Ironically, this constant battle against time and architecture led to one of the castle's few truly democratic experiences. From Lolly's scullery maid to the Lord himself, everyone eventually endured the disappointment of cutting into what should have been a perfect roast only to find it lukewarm at best. The shared sighs of resigned frustration crossing class boundaries represented perhaps the purest moment of unity in medieval life. Even kings learned to chew stoically through leathery meat that had spent its prime warmth waiting at a forgotten junction where the spice maid and wine steward were arguing about whose fault the delay was. Modern kitchens, with their convenient proximity to dining areas, owe their existence to generations of servants who finally rebelled against the insanity. The last straw came at Château de Brumet in 1582, when an entire state dinner arrived, so late and cold that the visiting dignitaries mistook the congealed aspic for decorative centerpieces. Within a decade, sensible architects were designing kitchens with direct access to dining halls, though many old retainers missed the challenge. As one retired butler wistfully told his apprentices, "You'll never know the triumph of delivering a still warm roll after sprinting up 4 flights with it tucked in your armpit." Today, in museums displaying antique servingware, we see only the polished silver and delicate porcelain. The true artifacts, the scorch marks from hasty reheating, the dents from corridor collisions, the faint grease stains of meals that barely made it, remain tucked away in servant quarters. They stand as silent tribute to those unsung heroes who turn cold victuals into a heated art form, and who proved daily that no architectural absurdity could fully defeat human ingenuity. Though perhaps they'd have traded all that ingenuity for just one properly hot meal served on time. Chapter 15. The Architect's Revenge. Behind every inexplicably placed staircase and corridor that terminated abruptly in a blank wall, there lingered a persistent rumor whispered among castle servants and muttered by frustrated nobles alike, that the incomprehensible layouts were an accident at all. Somewhere in the shadowy history of medieval architecture, an unknown number of builders had apparently decided that if they were going to be underpaid, overworked, and publicly blamed for every leaking roof, they might as well have some fun with it. Thus was born the most enduring and least provable conspiracy in castle construction, that certain architects deliberately designed fortresses to be impossible to navigate as their own private joke against the nobility. The evidence, while circumstantial, was compelling. Take the curious case of Château de Brumet, where the original plans called for a straightforward spiral staircase to connect the Great Hall with the private chambers above. The finished product contained no fewer than 7 identical-looking staircases, arranged in a confounding radial pattern, each leading to different destinations that included the chapel, the wine cellar, and, inexplicably, a small closet containing nothing but a single rusted spur. When questioned, the master mason claimed it was a defensive innovation before suddenly retiring to a distant monastery. At Blackmore Keep, the architect had ostensibly been instructed to create a system of secret passages for the Lord's private use. What he delivered was a labyrinth of interconnected tunnels that all ultimately led back to the same small antechamber where the Lord's least favorite portrait hung. Servants reported hearing faint laughter echoing from the walls for years afterward, particularly when the Lord was observed entering his secret passageway for the 100th time that week, his face growing redder with each return to that damned painting. Some architects employed more subtle tricks. The builder of Castle Thornhill famously designed all door handles to be placed just slightly higher than expected, forcing nobles to perform an undignified little hop each time they wished to enter a room. At Wexford Keep, every 3rd step in the main staircase was imperceptibly shorter than the others, creating a rhythmic stumble that visitors could never quite anticipate but always experienced. And in what could not possibly have been an accident, the privy at Ambercrest Castle was placed directly opposite a life-size tapestry of the previous lord judging the user with crossed arms and a disappointed expression. The most brazen example came from an anonymous builder at Harrenhal, who left behind a single cryptic notation in the foundations. 3rd turret leans on purpose. Let him figure it out. Generations of lords spent fortunes trying to correct the tower's slight list before realizing it was structurally sound and had apparently been intended as some sort of joke. The subsequent discovery that all weather vanes on the property pointed slightly askew no matter how often they were adjusted only deepened the mystery. Servants traded these stories like currency, each tale more elaborate than the last. There was the mason who built a perfect echo into the great hall that only repeated certain words, primarily the Lord's least favorite insults. The carpenter who fashioned all the chairs to creak in the exact pitch of a fart when nobles rose from the table. The unknown artisan who positioned a particular arrow slit to cast a shadow resembling a phallus on the opposite wall, precisely at noon on the summer solstice, ensuring the annual midsummer feast always included poorly concealed giggling from the lower tables. The supposed revenge extended to defensive features as well. Murder holes that drenched attackers in kitchen slops rather than boiling oil. Arrow slits angled so precisely they only provided clean shots at non-existent attackers approaching from the northwest. A notorious drawbridge at Montefiore Castle that lowered beautifully but required exactly 3 strong men and a blasphemous incantation to raise again. As one guard was overheard muttering during a particularly tense siege, either our architect was drunk or he really hated Lord Reginald's father. Some nobles fought back against the suspected sabotage. Lord Caxton, the suspicious, employed a team of building watchers to supervise every phase of construction, only to discover too late that they'd been given deliberately incorrect measuring rods that made every doorway slightly shorter than standard. The resulting procession of concussed noblemen inspired a brief fashion for padded helmets at court functions. Lady Eleanor of Blackmore took the opposite approach, allowing her architect complete freedom, and was rewarded with a castle that made perfect logical sense. If one happened to be left-handed and exactly 5 feet 2 inches tall, dimensions that coincidentally matched the builder precisely. The most compelling argument for intentional chaos came from castles that had been renovated by multiple architects over time. Like literary critics adding marginalia to a manuscript, each successive builder seemed to compound the original jokes while adding their own flourishes. Rexford Keep's infamous shifting stairs, which appeared to change position depending on the time of day, became even more confusing when a later architect added identical-looking false doors at each landing. And I am at a show, The original builder's prank had been subtle. His successors turned it into an art form. Perhaps the greatest testament to these architectural revenges was how they endured. Centuries later, long after the names of their creators had faded from memory, the jokes remained. A thumbed nose at authority preserved in stone and mortar. Modern historians might attribute odd design choices to defensive needs or stylistic trends. But anyone who'd spent an afternoon trying to find the privy in a medieval castle knew better. Somewhere in the past, a stoneworker had smiled to himself as he placed that one irregular step, knowing it would trip up nobles for generations to come. A carpenter had chuckled while planing a door just slightly too narrow, imagining the future frustration. An architect had gazed upon his finished creation, its halls and chambers arrayed in perfect, beautiful confusion, and thought, "Let them figure this out." And so we have, not by solving the puzzles, but by embracing them. These castles stand today not just as fortresses or homes, but as the world's most enduring practical jokes. Their punchlines, written in bewildered guests and exasperated servants across 8 centuries. The final revenge of those long-dead architects? That we still can't be entirely sure they were joking at all. The possibility remains that every inexplicable turn, every poorly placed door, every staircase to nowhere was completely sincere. Which might be the funniest joke of all. Chapter 16. The Bedchamber Conspiracy. The medieval castle's greatest secret wasn't hidden in some forgotten dungeon or coded into ancient tapestries. It was the open secret that half the noble family wasn't sleeping in their proper beds at all. After enduring one too many midnight journeys through bewildering corridors, Lords and ladies across Europe quietly abandoned the pretense of retiring to their official chambers, opting instead to curl up in whatever moderately flat surface they could find closest to where the evening's festivities ended. What began as desperate improvisation evolved into an unspoken system of nomadic slumber that would have horrified castle architects had any of them been able to find their own way through the buildings they'd designed. The problem started with simple geography. The traditional lord's bedchamber was typically placed in the most defensible position, often the highest point of the keep, accessible only via a gauntlet of twisting staircases and narrow passages that seemed designed to foil sleepy navigation. What made perfect sense for security became absurdity in practice, as wine-fogged nobles stumbled through the dark trying to remember whether the third landing went left at the tapestry of St. George, or right at the suspicious stain that might have been blood or possibly jam. Many gave up entirely, surrendering to the castle's whims and bedding down wherever exhaustion overtook them. Servants quickly learned to check an assortment of unlikely sleeping spots each morning. The Solar's window seat became a particular favorite among light-drinking ladies, who at least wanted the dignity of waking somewhere with cushions. The chapel pews saw regular use from those who'd stopped to pray for guidance and found themselves unable to continue. The castle archives at Wexford contained a startling number of estate documents with drool stains and cheek impressions, evidence of lords who'd sat down to review accounts only to be ambushed by slumber. And one memorable morning at Blackmoor Keep, the entire hunting party was discovered snoring in the kennels, having mistaken the hounds' warm, straw-filled enclosures for their own beds in the dark. These improvised sleeping arrangements spawned their own etiquette. A noble waking in an unexpected location would calmly request their morning ablutions, as if they'd planned it all along, and servants learned to provide them without comment. The butler at Ambercrest Castle kept a mental map of which nobles preferred which accidental bedrooms. The Duchess favored the linen closet for its privacy, while young Lord Edward consistently passed out in the same suits of armor, leading to a standing order to oil the joints every fortnight to prevent embarrassing squeaking when he emerged. Some castles embraced the chaos with structural adaptations. Thornhill Keep installed discreetly placed blankets and pillows in popular napping nooks. The Bishop of Winchester's residence featured small holy water fonts outside favored sleeping cupboards, allowing impromptu guests to perform their morning devotions without the walk of shame back to proper quarters. And at Château de Brume, the servants took to leaving small candelabras burning in the most commonly commandeered rooms, having learned the hard way that nothing ruined a morning like discovering your lord tangled in a tapestry he'd mistaken for bedding. The phenomenon reached its zenith during great feasts and celebrations, when wine flowed freely and the castle's layout became even more incomprehensible by candlelight. The morning after the famous 12-day Christmas feast at Harrenhal, servants discovered nobles sleeping in every conceivable location from the buttery to the dovecote, including one viscount who'd somehow wedged himself into a bread oven, thankfully cold, and was heard muttering about perfectly reasonable accommodations as they extracted. The castle's records note that year as the first time guest recovery surpassed food preparation in seasonal expenses. Married couples suffered particularly from this nocturnal diaspora. It became common for lords and ladies to go days without seeing each other except in passing, as one or both wound up sleeping in whatever semi-flat surface they'd collapsed upon the night before. The Earl of Warwick's marriage contract famously included a clause requiring at least 3 attempts per week to actually share a bedchamber. Though servants noted this was honored mainly when the weather was fine and neither had drunk more than 2 bottles before retiring. Some couples developed creative solutions. Lady Pembroke took to tying a length of yarn to her husband's belt each evening, so she could reel him in later, while Lord and Lady Caxton simply declared the library their official meeting place every morning, regardless of where they'd each slept. The bedchamber conspiracy had its hazards beyond simple embarrassment. Castle Blackmoor's infamous lost heir incident occurred when the Duchess, heavy with child, accidentally took up residence in a disused tower chamber and went unnoticed for 3 days, until her maid tracked her down by following a trail of discarded lemon rinds, the only food her mistress could stomach that week. The resulting heir was nicknamed Tower Tom for the rest of his life, despite eventually becoming Duke. Servants turned these nocturnal wanderings to their advantage. Clever maids would accidentally leave comfortable blankets in quiet corners they wished their masters to discover. The castle baker at Wexford famously maintained a particularly cozy nook near the ovens that saw so much noble use. He began charging for morning pastries, delivered directly to waking aristocrats. And more than one quick-thinking servant avoided punishment by claiming their master couldn't possibly have committed some nighttime offense. He'd been asleep in the stables all night, as 3 grooms could attest. By the Renaissance, as castles gave way to more sensibly designed palaces with bedrooms actually near entertainment spaces, the tradition of nomadic nobility dwindled, though not without protest. Many lords complained that the new, logical layouts lacked adventure in their nightly routines. Some especially traditional families continued the old ways out of stubbornness, deliberately placing their bedrooms inconveniently far and maintaining the pretense of getting lost on purpose. The Duke of Northumberland reportedly fired an architect for suggesting his bedchamber be moved closer to the dining hall, declaring such coddling unseemly for proper Englishmen. Today, in antique furniture collections, we occasionally encounter unusually sturdy window seats or strangely plush library ladders, quiet testaments to this forgotten tradition of aristocratic improvisation. Museum curators might describe them as examples of medieval comfort, but we know better. They're the archaeological remains of a time when the entire castle was one's bedroom, provided you could find a spot flat enough to lie down on, and weren't too proud to wake up with a tapestry pattern imprinted on your cheek. The true luxury wasn't a feather mattress, but simply waking up where you'd intended to sleep in the first place. Chapter 17. The Lost Art of Castle Wayfinding. Before the age of maps and signage, castle residents developed an entire secret language of navigation that turned their bewildering homes into something approximating livable spaces. These improvised wayfinding systems, passed down through generations like treasured family recipes, ranged from the practical to the absurd, each one a small rebellion against architectural chaos. What appeared to outsiders as random scratches, stains, and oddly placed objects were in reality a sophisticated survival system for those in the know. The most straightforward method involved strategic marking of walls and door frames. Servants carried nubs of chalk or charcoal to make nearly imperceptible symbols, indicating safe passages. A tiny cross might mark a corridor that actually led somewhere, while a smudged circle warned of dead ends. The system at Wexford Castle grew so elaborate it resembled an alchemist's notations, with special marks for leads to kitchen eventually, and a void when Lord Pembroke is drunk. These cryptic symbols were recopied during cleaning, preserved with the same care given to family crests and religious icons. Food-based navigation proved popular if problematic. The classic breadcrumb trail worked splendidly until castle dogs and rats treated it as an all-you-can-eat buffet. One innovative butler at Harrenhal switched to apple slices, which lasted longer but attracted wasps in summer months. The low point came at Ambercrest Castle, when a trail of cheese crumbs led not to freedom, but to the castle's entire feline population napping contentedly in a disused garderobe, having thoroughly enjoyed their unexpected feast. Textile clues offered more permanence. Tapestries were deliberately hung slightly askew to indicate worthwhile directions, while particular rug patterns marked safe routes through otherwise identical hallways. The housekeeper at Blackmore Keep maintained a system of colored drapes that changed weekly, creating a rotating cipher that kept visiting nobles perpetually off balance while servants moved with confidence. This worked beautifully until the Duke of Burgundy's visit, when he became convinced the changing fabrics were coded messages to French spies, leading to a month-long inquisition that uncovered nothing but the staff's understandable desire to find the kitchens without incident. Some residents turned to auditory cues. The scullery maids at Thornhill Castle developed a complex series of coughs and chair scrapes, to guide each other through the servant passages. A particularly musical steward at Chateau de Brumet would hum specific tunes when leading guests. A jaunty drinking song for the direct route to the great hall. A mournful dirge when passing through the draughty corridor where the lord's least favorite aunt was interred. The system grew so refined that during one famous feast, servants managed to steer an entire drunken hunting party safely to bed using nothing but strategically timed yawns and foot stomps. Olfactory wayfinding flourished, despite its obvious drawbacks. Kitchens weren't the only scented landmarks. The tanner's closet reeked of ammonia. The chaplain's quarters carried lingering incense. And the garderobes, well, their navigation value went without saying. Clever servants learned to follow the scent trails like bloodhounds, though this led to the unfortunate incident at Wexford when a new maid followed what she thought was the kitchen aroma, only to discover the lord's uncle fermenting something experimental in the West Tower. The aristocracy developed their own peculiar methods, often involving items of questionable utility. Lord Caxton famously scattered rare Venetian coins along his regular routes, creating what he called a fiscally responsible path home. Lady Eleanor of Blackmore employed a team of small dogs she trained to lead her to specific locations, though the system broke down when the pack realized the chapel was boring, and consistently diverted her to the kitchens instead. The low point in noble navigation came when young Lord Pembroke attempted to use his collection of scented candles as guideposts, succeeding only in setting several tapestries alarmingly aflame. Seasonal wayfinding took advantage of natural phenomena. In winter, residents followed the chilly drafts to locate unsecured windows and poorly hung doors. Summer revealed which stones stayed warm longest from sunlight exposure, creating thermal maps on floors and walls. Spring rains leaked through specific ceiling points, requiring careful hopscotch through certain hallways but providing excellent navigation cues. Autumn brought migrating spiders whose webs clustered in predictable patterns that, while terrifying, at least indicated which corridors saw the least foot traffic. Children proved remarkably adept at developing their own systems. Castle kids left behind trails of toys like tiny breadcrumbs, creating elaborate games that coincidentally led them safely home. The infamous treasure hunt of 1422 at Harrenhal began as young Thomas Blackmore's method to find his way to the stables, and ended with half the noble children of Yorkshire digging up the rose garden in search of non-existent gold. Servants often preserved these childhood path markers long after their creators had grown, sometimes accidentally guiding confused elders to safety via half-remembered toy trails. The true masters of castle wayfinding were the elderly retainers who'd learned every architectural quirk over decades of service. Old Nan at Wexford could navigate blindfolded by counting floorboard creaks. The one-eyed gatekeeper at Thornhill swore he could sense direction by how sounds echoed off particular walls. These human compasses became so valued that their retirement parties often turned into near panic as the household realized they'd lost their living maps. More than one pension was quietly increased after a lord spent his first week without his trusted guide, hopelessly wandering the very halls he supposedly owned. Religion provided another avenue for orientation. The truly lost could follow the sound of chanting to the chapel, or trace the smell of beeswax candles to the scriptorium. Some castles installed holy water fonts at key decision points, both for spiritual refreshment and as navigation aids. This system worked splendidly until the Great Schism of 1378, when competing popes led to competing fonts, and the castle's religious staff began moving them daily to confuse their rivals, inadvertently sending half the household on pilgrimages to the laundry instead of mass. By the time Renaissance ideals of symmetry and order reached castle design, these improvised wayfinding systems had become so ingrained that residents resisted their removal. Lords who'd once mocked servants for their chalk marks found themselves hopelessly adrift without them. The Earl of Warwick famously ordered his beautifully rational new palace's walls scribbled with fake navigation symbols because the emptiness made him nervous. Servants continued hiding their old marking tools long after they were needed, like retired soldiers keeping a dagger under the pillow. Today, in restored castles across Europe, docents explain the faded scratches on walls as damage from ancient battles or careless cleaning. But we know better. Those marks were lifelines, the desperate and clever inventions of people determined not to spend their lives lost in their own homes. They remind us that human ingenuity thrives best when faced with impossible challenges, like getting from the Great Hall to the Privy after dark without winding up in the moat. The true lost art wasn't wayfinding itself, but the humble acceptance that sometimes survival requires leaving a few breadcrumbs, literal or otherwise, along the path. Chapter 18. The Modern Tourist Struggle. Centuries of renovations, guided tours, and strategically placed gift shops have done remarkably little to prevent modern visitors from experiencing the same bewildering disorientation that plagued medieval castle residents. The same noble halls that once hosted frustrated lords, searching for their bedchambers, now echo with the confused murmurs of tourists clutching selfie sticks and audio guides, proving that no amount of signage can truly tame architecture designed by people who apparently thought right angles were a sign of moral weakness. The trouble begins at the ticket booth, where cheerful staff hand out brightly colored maps that might as well be abstract art for all their navigational utility. These documents reduce sprawling fortresses to tidy geometric shapes, replacing entire wings with helpful labels like service areas and arrows that point confidently toward features the builders forgot to include. The more honest maps include patches marked "Here be confusion" in Latin, though most visitors mistake this for historical charm rather than a sincere warning. By the time they've passed the third identical-looking suit of armor, even the most directional gifted tourist begins to suspect the map is more artistic interpretation than actual guide. Audio tours compound the problem with their cheerful narration that assumes visitors are exactly where they're supposed to be. As you stand in the magnificent Great Hall, the recording begins, while its listener is actually wedged in a narrow servant's passage, wondering where the hall might be. The more stubborn devices refuse to advance to the next track until reaching certain locations, creating a growing population of tourists circling the same tapestry, like frustrated satellites trying to achieve orbit. At Wexford Castle, staff regularly retrieve abandoned audio guides from the moat, their last words often being, "Now turn left toward the chapel," delivered to empty air as their former owner climbs a random staircase in desperation. Children adapt with remarkable creativity, treating castle navigation as an extended game of hide-and-seek, where the hiding spots are historical artifacts, and the seekers are increasingly frantic parents. The gift shop at Harrenhal does brisk business in "I got lost at Castle name" T-shirts, which staff discreetly suggest purchasing at the start of visits rather than the end. Teenagers separated from their groups inevitably claim they meant to get lost to experience authentic medieval vibes, though their text messages to parents begging for rescue suggest otherwise. Restoration efforts meant to improve accessibility often introduce new confusions. Handicap ramps that zigzag unpredictably to accommodate ancient architecture leave wheelchair users feeling like they're navigating an M.C. Escher sketch. Glass elevator shafts installed in medieval towers create the unsettling sensation of ascending through time periods. At Blackmore Keep, a well-intentioned Braille guide describes tapestries that were moved for cleaning in 1997, sending visually impaired visitors on a tactile hunt for artworks that haven't hung there in decades. The true test comes in locating bathrooms, a challenge that unites all visitors across language barriers and nationalities. Signs pointing toward modern restrooms often route tourists through sequences of chambers that suspiciously resemble historical privies, leading to awkward moments when someone mistakes an exhibit for its functional descendant. The Castle Cafe at Thornhill does steady business in diuretics like tea and soda, while maintaining only one obscurely marked toilet, creating what staff privately call the caffeine gauntlet. More than one marriage has been strained by the phrase, "I'll just quickly find the restroom before we go," delivered cheerfully by a partner who won't be seen again until the parking lot closes. Seasonal workers develop an uncanny ability to identify lost visitors by posture alone. The distinctive head swivel of someone trying to spot anything familiar, the hesitant steps that telegraph complete loss of confidence in cardinal directions. Veteran guides can predict exactly where each type of tourist will go astray. Germans invariably disappear near the armory. Japanese tour groups detour unexpectedly into the herb garden, and Americans somehow always wind up back at the gift shop, no matter where they begin. The castle's lost and found boxes brim with hats, cameras, and occasionally entire handbags abandoned when their owners fled in navigational despair. Some visitors lean into the chaos. Amateur photographers discover that getting spectacularly lost often leads to stumbling upon untouched corners where sunlight falls perfectly through arrow slits. Romantic partners find secluded alcoves that would make a medieval lady blush. At least one marriage proposal occurs annually in the disused chapel at Ambercrest Castle, typically after the would-be groom spends 40 minutes wandering hopelessly before deciding this is as good a spot as any. Children convinced they've discovered secret passages are often correct, though staff gently steer them away from the more structurally questionable ones. The castle's final joke comes at closing time, when weary docents must scour the premises for stragglers. These searches inevitably uncover visitors who've been moving in polite circles for hours, too embarrassed to ask for help. Some have developed elaborate theories about the castle's layout, convinced they've decoded some ancient pattern. Others simply sit resignedly where they last had cell reception, waiting for rescue like medieval nobles once waited for servants to find them. A fortunate few discover they've been standing 10 feet from the exit the whole time, separated only by what appeared to be a solid wall, but was actually a cunningly disguised door. The architect's last laugh, echoing across 8 centuries. Perhaps this shared experience across time is the castle's true gift. When a modern tourist emerges blinking into the sunlight after hours of wandering, they've tasted something authentic beyond the staged exhibits and polished armor displays. They've known, however briefly, what it meant to live in a world where no amount of technology could prevent you from getting hopelessly lost in your own home. And if they listen very carefully as they finally locate the parking lot, they might hear the faintest ghostly chuckle. Some long-dead resident pleased to see the castle still works its magic on visitors. The more things change, the more they stay gloriously, bafflingly the same. Chapter 19. The Last Laugh of History. There exists a peculiar dissonance between how castles were actually experienced by their inhabitants and how we remember them centuries later. The same architectural absurdities that drove medieval nobles to frustrated tears now spark romantic sighs from modern observers. Those cold, confusing labyrinths that left servants cursing and lords hopelessly lost have transformed in our collective imagination into paragons of noble elegance and fairy tale charm. This collective amnesia represents history's greatest practical joke. Our stubborn insistence on seeing these impractical stone mazes through rose-tinted stained glass. The romanticization begins with childhood stories, where castles serve as perfect backdrops for adventure rather than architectural nightmares. Fairy tale princesses glide effortlessly through halls that never seem to leave them, stranded searching for a privy. Knights return seamlessly to great halls that in reality would have required 3 left turns at confusing tapestries, and a leap of faith across that one uneven stair. The castle's true nature as a daily obstacle course gets smoothed over in favor of turrets that catch golden sunlight just so. Never mind that those same towers were impossible to heat and prone to leaking during storm. Modern tourism completes the illusion. What was once a cold stone maze becomes a carefully curated experience with gift shops placed conveniently near exits. Guided tours follow sensible loops that avoid the castle's more sadistic architectural choices. The same halls that hosted frustrated medieval nobles now feature tasteful signage and handy benches for tired visitors, creating the comfortable fiction that these buildings were always meant to be navigated with ease. The closest most tourists come to authentic medieval confusion is briefly misplacing their group before being shepherded back by helpful staff, a far cry from spending 3 days trapped in your own wine cellar. Hollywood has done its part to rewrite castle realities. Films show noble characters sweeping dramatically through halls that somehow always lead exactly where they need to go. Not once does a romantic hero pause mid-monologue to scratch his head at a junction of identical corridors. Historical dramas never depict the hours of behind-the-scenes wandering required to stage those perfect encounters between star-crossed lovers. Even battle scenes neatly avoid showing defenders getting lost on their way to the walls, though castle records suggest this happened with embarrassing frequency. The castle's modern rebranding as a romantic ideal speaks to our deep longing for connection with the past. We want to believe nobles lived in graceful splendor rather than perpetual mild confusion. It's more comforting to imagine elegant ladies never tripping over uneven steps, to picture lords confidently navigating their domains, rather than sheepishly asking scullery maids for directions to their own bedrooms. The truth, that castle life involved as much stumbling about as stately procession, ruins the fantasy we've worked so hard to construct. Perhaps the most telling evidence of this romanticization lies in modern castle-inspired homes. Wealthy enthusiasts build faithful recreations of medieval towers and great halls while quietly installing central heating, indoor plumbing, and most damning of all, sensible floor plans. The very people who sigh over ancient blueprints inevitably hire architects to improve flow and maximize livability. Tacit acknowledgments that what charms us in theory would drive us mad in practice. No matter how much we claim to love authenticity, nobody actually wants a bedroom that requires map, compass, and trail rations to reach from the kitchen. The castle's endurance as a romantic symbol reveals something fundamental about human nature. We don't love these buildings despite their impracticalities. We love them because of them. There's something deeply comforting about structures that prioritized grandeur over convenience, that valued security above all else, even if it meant residents occasionally got locked in the linen closet. In an age of open-plan efficiency and minimalist design, the castle stands gloriously unrepentant in its refusal to make sense. Its very stubbornness becomes the appeal. Our ancestors would likely find this romanticization hilarious. The medieval noble who spent half his life lost in his own halls would scarcely recognize the gushing descriptions in modern travel brochures. The servants who developed elaborate marking systems to navigate their workplace would roll their eyes at our wistful sighs over atmospheric passageways. And the architects, if they truly did build in deliberate jokes, as legend suggests, would be delighted to see their mischief transformed into features rather than flaws. Yet there's value in this selective memory. The castle's transformation from frustrating reality to beloved ideal mirrors how all history gets polished by time. The rough edges smooth over, the daily irritations fade, and what remains is the essence, the grandeur, the romance, the connection to something greater than ourselves. We don't remember the cold drafts, only the roaring fires. We forget the confusing layouts, recalling instead the thrill of discovery around each corner. The castle becomes not what it was, but what we need it to be. In the end, these contradictory views need not cancel each other out. The castle can be both impractical maze and noble ideal, both architectural headache and object of wistful admiration. Perhaps what we truly romanticize isn't the buildings themselves, but the human ingenuity that flourished within them. The servants who found ways to cope, the nobles who turned getting lost into a virtue, the generations who lived, loved, and occasionally cursed within those confounding walls. The last laugh belongs not just to history, but to all of us who continue finding meaning in these magnificent, ridiculous, wonderful stone puzzles. Chapter 20. A Soothing Farewell to the Lost. The true lesson of the castle is not how to avoid getting lost, but how to surrender to it. For centuries, these stone labyrinths have been teaching residents and visitors alike the same humbling truth. No matter how important you are, no matter how carefully you plan, sometimes you will wind up somewhere unexpected. The castle, in all its confounding glory, is the great equalizer. A place where lords and scullery maids alike have stood in silent frustration before the same dead-end corridor, wondering how they got there and how on earth to escape. There is a quiet comfort in this shared human experience. The medieval noble who gave up searching for his chambers and slept in the stable loft was no different from the modern tourist who abandons the audio guide and follows the smell of coffee back to the gift shop. The servant who left chalk marks on the walls was an ancestor to the phone-wielding visitor dropping digital pins on a maps app, both muttering under their breath as they retrace their steps. The castle's chaos transcends time, connecting us across centuries through the universal language of mild navigational despair. Perhaps that is why we still return to these places, despite their stubborn refusal to make logical sense. In a world that insists on efficiency, on clarity, on the straightest path from point A to point B, the castle remains a glorious relic of delightful dysfunction. It reminds us that wandering is not failing, that sometimes the best discoveries happen when you meant to go somewhere else entirely, that even those powerful lords of history still needed to ask for directions now and then. The ghosts of these places understand this best. The phantom footsteps echoing in empty hallways are not just remnants of tragedy or romance. They are the sound of someone who still hasn't found the way out. The creak of a floorboard is not a threat, but a sympathetic sigh from a long-dead resident who once stood in that very spot, equally turned around. Even the castle's most infamous spirits, the headless huntsman eternally circling the wrong tower, the weeping maiden forever waiting at the wrong balcony, are not so much haunting as they are commiserating. They are still lost, just like we are sometimes, and there is something oddly reassuring in that. So the next time you find yourself standing in a castle corridor, unsure whether to go left or right, take a moment to appreciate the absurdity. You are participating in a tradition as old as the stones around you. The servants who once scurried past these walls would nod in recognition. The nobles who once ruled here would stifle a laugh, remembering their own misadventures. Even the architects, if they really were the mischievous tricksters of legend, would be delighted to see their work still baffling visitors centuries later. And if, after all this, you still feel a flicker of frustration as you wander, remember, somewhere in history, a lord once got so lost in his own castle that he accidentally attended the wrong wedding. A bishop once spent an entire night locked in a pantry with only a wheel of cheese for company. A cook, carrying a tray of what should have been warm tarts, once rounded the same corner 7 times before sitting down and eating them all in defeat. You are in good company. So breathe deep. Turn left or right. Or if all else fails, follow the smell of bread, the sound of laughter, or the faintest draft of fresh air. You'll get where you're going eventually. Or you won't, and that's all right too. After all, isn't that what castles have been telling us all along? Good night, noble traveler. May your dreams be as winding and wondrous as the halls behind your eyelids. And if you wake up somewhere unexpected, well, you'll know what to do.